There are some days the calendar won't let you forget, not because you mark them down, but because they mark you. June 5th is one of those days. On that date, both Breonna Taylor and Tyre Nichols were born. Two black lives that still should be here, living, breathing, dreaming. They should be turning 31, but instead of birthday candles and photos, we have memorials. Instead of joy, we have grief. Instead of their voices, we have silence. You've probably heard their names, seen their faces on protest signs, or watched the footage. But today, I don't want to talk about what was done to them. I want to talk about who they were. Because before the footage, before the rallies, before the hashtags, they were people. Breonna was a caregiver, a daughter, a future nurse. Tyre was a father, a skater, a lover of sunsets and photography. And on this episode of After the Headlines, Unheard Stories, we're going to take the time to honor them, not just for how they died, but for how they lived. We'll talk about what birthdays mean after loss, how grief can stretch across a community, and what it really means to carry memory as resistance. I'm your host, Solomon Richberg, licensed clinical social worker, and someone who believes that healing begins when we look past the headlines and remember the human story underneath. Wherever you are right now, walking, cleaning, sitting in silence, I invite you to slow down with me. Breathe. We begin with Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor should be 31 years old this week. June 5th. That's the date on the calendar, but for her mother, her family, her community, more than a birthday. It's a reminder of joy, grief, and what could have been. I've spoken about her before on this podcast, but today, I don't want to just speak about it. I want to feel it, to remember her as a symbol of injustice, but as a full human being. Breonna was born in 1993 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, but she was raised in Louisville, Kentucky, a city that one day be plastered across headlines for all the wrong reasons. For a young age, Breonna was described as bright and driven. Her mom said she always had a nurturing spirit. She liked to take care of people. That led her to study to become an EMT. She worked in the emergency room at 2 hospitals, but wasn't famous. She wasn't trying to be. She just wanted to live her life, do right by her family, and help people in need. But her life was cut short, violently, and without accountability. On the night of March 13th, 2020, Breonna was at home in her apartment, in her bed, asleep beside her boyfriend. In the early hours of that morning, police executed a botched no-knock warrant. They broke into her home unannounced. Her boyfriend, believing it was a break-in, fired a warning shot. The officers responded by firing more than 30 rounds. Breonna was struck multiple times. She died on the floor of her own hallway. No medical attention was given. No one checked her pulse for over 20 minutes. Breonna never made it to the hospital where she worked. Her name wasn't in the headlines that next morning. In fact, it took months for her story to even make national news. Why does it take outrage for a black woman's death to even be noticed? Why do black women have to become hashtags to be believed? I want to ask you right now, listening, when was the last time you thought of Breonna not as the case, but as a person? Tamika Palmer, her mother, said, "I'm still waiting for someone to explain to me how Breonna's life was worth so little. How she went from being everything to me to becoming evidence." That quote sits heavy. We talk about justice, we march, we repost graphics, we call out names, but in the quiet, in the ordinary days, how do we honor a life that was interrupted? Breonna was planning trips, talking about a future. She loved her family, her friends, her little cousins. She was silly, she danced. She had this infectious smile that people still talk about. And on June 5th, she should be blowing out candles, laughing. Maybe going on a vacation she never got to take. But instead, there's silence. Breonna Taylor's death sparked a wave of protests across the country and the world. But even with all that visibility, the officers involved largely escape accountability. That's injustice. It's not just illegal, it's emotional, it's cultural. Because every time a black woman is killed and forgotten, the world tells us that our grief isn't urgent, that our stories are just side notes. And I'm here to say, not on this show, not on After the Headlines, we remember Breonna for who she was, a woman with dreams, a daughter with a deep love in her heart, a caregiver with ambition. She mattered. And on what would have been her 31st birthday, I want to say her name, not just out of anger, but out of love. Breonna, you're more than a headline. You were joy. You were light. You were enough. And we haven't forgotten you. Coming up after the break, we'll talk about Tyre Nichols, another 31-year-old whose life was stolen by a system meant to protect. But first, a moment to breathe. If you're listening right now and you're feeling the heaviness of these stories, that's okay. Let's do a 4-7-8 exercise. Let's take a deep breath for the count of 4. We hold it for the count of 7. And exhale out for the count of 8. There are some days the calendar won't let you forget. Not because you marked them down, but because they mark you. On June 5th, Tyre Nichols should be 31 this week too. Like Breonna, he was born on June 5th, 1993. And like Breonna, Tyre was so much more than the story that made the headlines. I think a lot how we often don't get to meet black men like Tyre in the media until after they are gone. When you search his name, you'll find news clips, police body cam footage, and a timeline of violence. But that's not who Tyre was. That's not what made him laugh. Not what gave him peace. Not what he lived for. Tyre Nichols was a free spirit, a skater, a photographer. He was someone who'd drive out to capture the sunset with his camera. His mother said he had a creative eye, that he loved beauty, light, the kind of moments most people overlook. And that says a lot about his heart. Tyre wasn't loud or flashy. He wasn't seeking conflict. He was the kind of person who'd rather listen to music and vibe on a solo skate than to be caught up in the drama. He moved to Memphis to be closer to his mother and stepfather. He was working at FedEx. He was building his life. He had a 4-year-old son. Let me say that again. He was a father. And from everything that I've read, he loved that little boy. He wasn't perfect. None of us are. But Tyre was trying. He was showing up. He was loving the people around him. He should be here. On January 7th, 2023, Tyre was pulling over during what police called a traffic stop. But what followed wasn't a stop. It was an ambush. He was beaten by 5 Memphis police officers who looked like him. And that's something we have to talk about. Because the pain doesn't just come from who did it, it comes from what it says about the system that trained them, empowered them, protect them, until they couldn't anymore. Tyre was heard calling for his mother, crying out, just 100 yards from home. And when the footage was released, many of us felt shattered. Again. But for black men especially, it was something different. It broke my heart. It's the reminder that no matter how gentle, how creative, how peaceful you are, it might not matter. I want to say this directly to any black men listening. Your kindness matters. Your life is not defined by how tough you are. Tyre should have been allowed to skate freely, to chase light through a camera's lens, to raise his son in peace. He should be here turning 31, uploading new photos, posting about fatherhood, calling his mom to say, "I love you." I want to read a quote from Tyre's mother, Ravon Wells. She said, "He was a beautiful soul. He was just his own person. He didn't deserve this." And she's right. None of this is about deserving. Tyre's life was his own. And this week, we just don't mourn what happened. We remember who he was: a son, a father, a dreamer, a man who saw beauty in the world and become part of it. So what do birthdays mean after death? What does it mean to say happy birthday when the person you're saying to is gone? These dates don't disappear. They show up on your phones, in our memories, in the way our body feels heavy without always knowing why. For families like Breonna and Tyre, June 5th isn't just a day, it's a fracture. It's the tension between celebration and sorrow, between what was and what will never be. In clinical work, we sometimes call this a grief anniversary, a moment when emotional pain intensifies, not always because we choose to focus on it, but because memory insists on being felt. And for Black families, especially those whose grief is tied to state violence, there's often no time to mourn quietly. There's the legal system, the press, the public commentary. Imagine trying to grieve your child while strangers debate whether they deserve to die. For Breonna's mother, for Tyre's mother, there is no true closure. There's only memory and movement. So today, I want to honor that space, that sacred place between sorrow and strength. I want to say this to those listening, especially to Black listeners who carry your own stories, your own grief, your own quiet rage. You don't have to relive the trauma to prove you care. You don't have to watch the footage. You don't have to post on social media every time a name trends. Your grief is valid, whether it's loud or silent, public or private. And if June 5th feels heavy for you, even if you don't know them personally, that's not weakness, that's empathy. It's what happens when we allow ourselves to feel what the world so often tries to numb. And in that grief, there's also power. That's because remembering isn't passive, it's active, it's sacred. It's protesting a world that wants you to move on. So yes, we say happy birthday. Even through the tears, we light candles. We hold space. We say, Breonna, we remember you. Tyre, we carry you forward. And we keep telling your stories, not because the trauma defines you, but because your life matters. And we refuse to let the world forget that. These stories isn't easy. Sitting in the weight of this grief, this injustice, week after week, it takes something out of you. But it also gives something back. Because storytelling, when done with care and truth, is a form of resistance. When I started After the Headlines, I didn't want to just talk about crime. I wanted to talk about the people, the humanity, the dignity that often gets lost when a story goes viral and then it vanishes. Breonna Taylor wasn't trending anymore when I wrote this episode. Tyre Nichols isn't front page news. But that doesn't mean their stories are over. In fact, that's when the real work begins. After headlines fade, that's when we decide, are we going to remember people when they're hashtags? Or are we going to keep saying their names, telling their stories, and demanding a world where lives like theirs are valued before they're taken? Storytelling gives us a chance to interrupt the cycle, to create space for healing and accountability, not just outrage. When we're talking about Breonna Taylor as a daughter, a nurse in training, a bright light in her family, when we talk about Tyre Nichols as a father, a skater with a camera, we're not just mourning, we're refusing to let the system define them by their last moments. We're reclaiming their narrative, and maybe that's what advocacy is really about. telling the full story, not just tragedy, but the tenderness, not just injustice, but the joy that was stolen. That's why this show exists. That's why I stay up writing and researching long after the spotlight has moved on. Because people like Breonna and Tyre deserve more than a headline. They deserve memory, honor, and truth. So as we close this episode, I want to invite you to reflect. What does it mean to carry a story forward? Not just repeat it, but carry it, live it. What does it look like to keep showing up for people the world tried to erase? That's the heart of this podcast, and that's the heart of storytelling as advocacy. And I'm grateful you're here doing that with me. In a moment, we'll close out with final reflection, a space to say their names one more time with honor and honor their light. Telling stories like Breonna and Tyre isn't just political, it's psychological. As a clinician, I've seen how repeated exposure to injustice, especially racialized trauma, can leave deep, invisible wounds. When we witness state violence, even indirectly, we experience what is called vicarious trauma. The emotional residue left behind from hearing or seeing others' pain. You may not have known Breonna personally or Tyre, but your body remembers. Your nervous system holds the tension. That's why sometimes, even years later, a headline or image can flood us with anger, helplessness, or sadness. Feelings that don't always make sense logically, but are entirely valid. It's part of what we call collective grief. Grief that spreads beyond family or friends. Grief that touches a whole community, a culture, a people. And for Black communities, that grief is often compounded, layered by history, by injustice, by the constant messaging that our lives are only valuable when there's outrage attached. Storytelling helps us push back. In therapy, we often use a process called narrative reprocessing, helping people reclaim their stories by reframing trauma through new meaning. This show, this platform, is doing that work on a collective level. We're saying these were not just victims, they were whole people. And when we say their names with context, with softness, with truth, we engage in something called post-traumatic meaning making. That means we don't just react to trauma, we shape the way it's remembered. And it's powerful, especially in a world that profits off of Black suffering without offering Black healing. When we tell these stories with depth, we remember Breonna as a caregiver, Tyre as an artist. We interrupt the dehumanization cycle and begin the work of rehumanization. That's not just activism, that's therapy. It's community care. And it's why I keep coming back to this mic. Because I know that storytelling can hold trauma and hope in the same breath. So if you ever felt overwhelmed hearing these stories, that's not weakness, that's your empathy. And if you've ever chosen to turn away for your own peace, that's not avoidance. That's a trauma response and is valid. The work of justice is not about staying broken. It's about holding pain with purpose and choosing again and again to bear witness. Because healing doesn't always look like resolution. Sometimes it just looks like remembrance. And that's why we tell these stories, not just to inform, but to transform. As we close today, I want to say something directly to you. If you've listened this far, if you sat in the weight of this episode, if you felt your chest tighten or your throat close or your mind wander somewhere painful, that's not just a reaction, that's your body doing the work of grief. That's your nervous system responding to loss, and that's okay. Grief doesn't always look like crying. Sometimes it looks like anger. Sometimes it looks like numbness. Sometimes it looks like sitting in silence with a heavy heart. That silence, it matters. That stillness is part of the healing. And so, before we leave this space, I want to offer something simple. A moment. A few quiet seconds to hold space for Breonna Taylor, for Tyre Nichols, and for every name we carry in our hearts that never made it to the headlines. They should be here. They should be 31. And because they're not, we say their names. Not to center pain, but to affirm presence. Breonna Taylor, Tyre Nichols, we remember you. We honor you, we honor your light, and we carry you forward. If this episode moves something in you, I invite you to take action in the way that feels right. Light a candle on June 5th. Share this episode with someone who needs it. Or support the work by joining our Patreon, where we continue these conversations with care. You can also find more reflection, behind the scenes, process notes, and bonus audio companion for this week, exclusive for our supporters. Because healing doesn't happen alone, and neither does remembrance. I'm Solomon Richberg, LCSW, and this is After the Headlines. And this week, we choose to remember. Say their names: Breonna Taylor, Tyre Nichols.